Every time I asked a question, he reminded me who paid for my college. Every time I disagreed, he pulled me off a project. And every time I tried to leave, he made sure I knew the cost. My father called it loyalty. I called it what it really was. The legal document arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a courier who made me sign for my own disinheritance. I read it twice, then set it on my kitchen counter next to my coffee mug. For the first time in my 24 years, I didn't cry when my father hurt me. Instead, I felt something I'd never experienced before: relief. But let me start from the beginning. My father always had this way of making silence feel like a deal. Growing up in the Thompson household in Dallas meant understanding that love came with terms and conditions spelled out in invisible contracts that shifted whenever I thought I'd finally learned the rules. When I was 12, Dad started bringing me to his office on Saturday mornings. Thompson Capital Management occupied 2 floors of a steel and glass building in downtown Dallas, with views that stretched across the city like a promise of everything I could inherit if I played my cards right. "Observe," he said on that first visit, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "This is your future, Emily. Everything you see here will be yours someday." I pressed my face against the windows, watching the cars move through the streets below. The weight of his expectation felt heavier than his hand. "But what if I want to be a teacher?" I asked. "Or a doctor?" "Teachers don't change the world," he interrupted. "Business leaders do. We shape economies. We create jobs. We build legacies." At 12, I didn't know how to argue with legacy. By 14, I was spending every weekend at the office learning the business while my friends were at soccer practice or the mall. Dad called it executive training. I called it my stolen childhood, though never out loud. When I turned 16, Dad bought me a Lexus. Brand new pearl white with leather seats that made my friends jealous. It was beautiful, and it was a cage. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," he said, dangling the keys just out of reach. "Now you can drive yourself to the office. No more excuses." The car came with conditions. Perfect grades weren't enough. I had to maintain a 4.0 GPA. Weekend office visits became mandatory. Miss one and the car stayed in the garage. At 17, I graduated valedictorian and was accepted to USC's business program. I'd actually applied to 7 schools with different majors, but somehow only USC's acceptance letter made it to Dad's attention. "This is it," he said, framing the letter. 4 years at USC, then you come home and we make history together." I wondered what had happened to my acceptance to University of Texas's journalism program, but questioning Dad's version of events had never ended well. College should have been my escape, but Dad made sure the golden leash stretched all the way to Los Angeles. He paid for everything: tuition, room, and board, even my social activities. Every month, a deposit appeared with a note. "For my future business partner. Love, Dad." But love with strings attached isn't love at all. It's an investment. He called twice a week, always steering conversations toward business applications. When I mentioned an interesting literature course, he'd ask how it related to corporate communications. When I talked about volunteer work, he wanted to know what networking opportunities it provided. "Remember why you're there," he'd say. "This isn't about finding yourself. This is about preparing to lead Thompson Capital into the next generation." My junior year, I took a creative writing elective. Professor Williams was this energetic woman who spoke about storytelling like it was sacred. For the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me that had nothing to do with profit margins. I wrote a short story about a girl trapped in a glass office building, watching life through windows she couldn't open. Professor Williams pulled me aside after class. "You have real talent," she said. "Have you considered pursuing writing seriously?" The question haunted me. Late at night in my dorm, I found myself writing stories in notebooks I hid under my mattress. Stories about people who chose their own paths, who broke free from expectations. When I came home for spring break, I made a mistake. I told Dad about the writing class. His reaction was swift. Within a week, I'd been promoted to a more demanding summer role that required 40-hour weeks. There was no time for creative writing workshops, only Thompson Capital and the future he'd mapped out for me. "Writers are dreamers," he explained over dinner. "Dreamers don't build empires. You can write as a hobby when you're running the company." After graduation, I moved into a downtown apartment Dad had chosen 4 blocks from the office. It was sleek and modern, with granite countertops and a city view. It was also empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. "Now the real work begins," Dad announced at my graduation party. "Emily is going to revolutionize investment management. Aren't we lucky?" Everyone applauded, and I smiled my practice smile. But inside, I felt like I was suffocating. My official role was senior investment analyst, which meant I wrote reports Dad either approved or rewrote entirely. I attended client meetings where I was introduced as the future of the company, but rarely allowed to speak unless prompted. The deeper I got into the company, the more I understood that loyalty was Dad's favorite weapon. He wielded it like a sword, cutting down any hint of independence. I learned this during my first year. We were preparing a major presentation for a real estate client. I'd researched their target market and had an idea about repositioning their investment strategy to appeal to younger investors rather than just retirees. During the meeting, I presented my research confidently. Several team members nodded, and the client seemed intrigued. Dad smiled throughout, asking probing questions that made me think he was interested. "Good work," he said afterward. "You're really coming into your own." 2 days later, I'd been quietly removed from the project. My access was revoked. My name disappeared from emails, and suddenly everyone was too busy to discuss the strategy with me. When I asked Dad about it, his explanation was casual. "We can't have loose ends, Emily. Your idea was interesting, but we're going with a traditional approach." That was his way of saying fall back in line. I learned to keep my ideas to myself, to nod when I disagreed, to smile when I wanted to scream. The price of having opinions was losing access to the work itself. That's when my college friend Rachel's mother died. Rachel was working as a photographer in Seattle, scraping by, but happier than anyone I knew. At the funeral, we found a letter her mother had written. "My dearest Rachel, I'm so proud of who you've become. I worried about your career choice, but watching you follow your passion has taught me about courage. You chose your own path even when it was harder. I love who you are, not who I thought you should be." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. When had Dad ever expressed pride in me for who I was rather than what I achieved? I couldn't remember a single instance. The next Sunday at dinner, I set down my fork and asked, "Dad, would you still love me if I left the company?" He didn't look up from his wine. The grandfather clock ticked in the silence. Finally, "Don't be dramatic, Emily. Not yes, not of course, just a dismissal." The silence that followed felt like a verdict. That night, I packed a bag with essentials and my hidden notebooks. I left behind the jewelry he'd given me, the designer clothes, the expensive art he'd chosen. I drove across town to a neighborhood near TCU and rented a small studio with my own savings. The apartment was tiny and needed paint, but every choice was mine. The bed sheets, the coffee mug, the books, all mine. Dad didn't call for 3 weeks. When contact finally came, it wasn't a phone call. It was the legal document. I'd been officially removed from the succession plan. No trust fund, no board seat, no family shares. The paperwork was thorough and coldly professional, like something you'd send to a business rival, not your daughter. No personal note, no explanation, just a legal severance of ties. I read it twice, then set it next to my coffee mug. And for the first time in my life, I didn't cry when my father hurt me, because I finally understood he wasn't punishing me for leaving the company. He was punishing me for choosing myself, but he didn't understand that I'd already won. The moment I walked away from his version of my future, I'd reclaimed something more valuable than any inheritance, my own life. That afternoon, I opened my laptop and started writing. Not a business plan, but a story. My story. The one I'd been afraid to tell for 24 years. And for the first time since I was 12, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. If you've ever been told love means obedience, if your loyalty has ever been used as leverage, just know you're not disloyal for wanting freedom.